Revan knew something was off when he saw the black cars parked outside his house, and it was confirmed the moment he walked through the front door and saw his father standing in the dim light, looking as guilty as ever. His father's voice, usually strong, sounded broken when he finally spoke. I had no choice, Revan. They were going to take everything. Our home, our lives. I had to. The Alpha King made me an offer. Revan's heart dropped when he heard the Alpha King had bought him. He had thought it was just some wealthy man. Revan knew what this meant. His father was prone to poor decisions, especially with debt piling up and his once thriving business crumbling. But he never imagined his father would sell him to pay off that debt. So you sold me? He asked, hoping that was not the case. His father's shoulders slumped in defeat, confirming the betrayal. Revan's hands clenched into fists, and he forced his expression to not show how hurt he really was. Before he could say anything else, he was taken into the car by two buff men. He didn't even try to struggle, as he already accepted his fate. He arrived at the Alpha King's palace, and he saw the king seating on his throne, looking as powerful as the stories he heard about him had said. The Alpha King watched Revan approach with assessing eyes. Revan held his head high, meeting the Alpha's gaze, which is unheard of. You're the one they sent to settle your father's debt, the Alpha King stated, his voice deep and calm but also amused, as if he found the whole ordeal to be slightly entertaining. Seems that way, Revan replied. The Alpha tilted his head, studying him. Not quite what I expected, he murmured to himself, but it was loud enough for Revan to hear. Revan raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. Sorry to disappoint, he said, sarcastically. The Alpha was surprised. No one had ever talked to him in that manner before. He thought it was actually kind of nice to be treated like a normal person for once, and not looked at like he was the most dangerous person to ever exist. Even though he kinda was. He rose from his throne and began to walk down the steps, his eyes never leaving Revan's. When he finally stood before Revan, he was close, but Revan held his ground. You don't fear me? The Alpha asked, his voice low. Revan shrugged, meeting his gaze. Should I? A slow smile crept up the Alpha King's face, and he seemed almost amused, as if Revan's defiance were a breath of fresh air in his rigid, ordered world. Here he was, the ruler that was feared by many, standing before a small Omega who looked him dead in the eyes without fear. Most would answer differently, especially when standing in front of someone who could end their life with a single command. Then I guess I'm not most people, Revan said with a fearless look in his eyes. But his heart was beating so hard, he prayed the Alpha King could not hear it. Stepping even closer, the Alpha asked, what's your name? Revan wanted to sassily tell him to step back, but he didn't want to die from his own stupidity. At least not yet. Revan, he answered, also refusing to step back, even as the Alpha loomed over him. Revan, the Alpha repeated, interesting. I'll remember it. Then, with a flick of his hand, the Alpha signaled the guards to lead Revan to his quarters. You'll stay here, under my protection and my rules. Let's see if that spirit of yours survives. Revan turned to follow the guards, not saying another word to the king. That evening, Revan was walking through the quiet corridors, when he rounded a corner and nearly collided in a hard chest. He looked up to find the Alpha standing there. Lost, are we? The Alpha murmured, a hint of teasing in his tone. Revan straightened, regaining his composure. Not lost, just looking for some air. The Alpha raised an eyebrow. In my private quarters. Revan's eyes widened slightly. He had not known that it was the Alpha's quarter. If that's where I ended up, it was an accident, he said. The Alpha chuckled. You're bold, Revan. I wonder if you know how dangerous a place like this can be. Revan met his gaze, not backing down. I've heard the stories, but I don't plan on hiding in some corner just because you're used to people fearing you. The Alpha took a step closer, and reached up to brush the stray hairs away from Revan's face, lingering just a bit too long. You're fascinating, he murmured, his voice low, almost soft. I'm not sure I've ever met an Omega quite like you. Revan's heart raced, but he kept his face carefully neutral, refusing to let the Alpha see the effect he had on him. Then maybe you should get out more. The Alpha's gaze darkened. Careful, Revan. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Revan alone in the hallway, his heart pounding. The next week, Revan found himself bored. He wasn't treated like a servant, so he had no chores to do, which he found a bit weird. He had thought he would be made to do all sort of brutal jobs. He had already imagined scrubbing the ceilings or something. Another thing was that he was constantly disturbed by the Alpha's presence. He would catch the Alpha watching him from across the room during meals, or when he walked through the palace. And there were brief moments where the Alpha surprised him with unexpected kindness. He would make sure Revan's meals were prepared to his liking, by literally going to the kitchen himself to inspect the food the maids were cooking, leaving the maids shocked because he was never seen in the kitchen. Or when he notices that Revan had been looking bored all day, he would leave a warm blanket and a book laying around in Revan's quarters, where Revan spends most of his time. Revan would immediately know it was the Alpha's doing, due to his scent lingering on the book. Revan was so bored one day, he decided to roam around the halls of the Alpha's palace. He wanted to escape the eyes of guards and servants, who watched his every move with curiosity on their faces. Every eye watching him was a reminder that he was somewhere he didn't belong. He was just about to head back toward his chambers when he turned around and froze. There, leaning casually against the wall, with his arms crossed, stood the Alpha King. The Alpha's dark gaze locked onto him, and a chill slid down Revan's spine. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, but he forced himself to appear calm, lifting his chin slightly as if to show he wasn't intimidated. He wouldn't let the Alpha see any fear in him. Lost again? The Alpha asked, his voice amused. Revan straightened, trying to keep his voice steady. I was just exploring. The Alpha's eyes gleamed with something dark as he took a step forward, blocking the only exit from the corridor. Revan tensed as he watched the Alpha draw closer, his movement slow, calculated, like a predator closing in on its prey. Exploring? The Alpha's lips curved into a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Funny, you always seem to be exploring the parts of my palace I told you to avoid. Revan's breath caught, but he forced himself to shrug nonchalantly. Maybe you should make your rules clearer. The Alpha's smile faded. He closed the gap between them, stepping so close suddenly that Revan gasped softly. Revan had to tilt his head upwards to meet his eyes. Are you trying to see how far you can push me? The Alpha voice was so low it was almost a growl. Revan swallowed, his pulse racing as he fought to keep his composure. I don't know what you're talking about. You're not afraid of me, are you? Why should I be? The Alpha tilted his head. Because you're standing before someone who doesn't take disobedience lightly. He reached out, his hand brushing against Revan's cheek, and Revan fought the urge to flinch, to pull away. The Alpha's fingers traced a line down Revan's jaw, and Revan's heart pounded harder. I think you're braver than you let on. The Alpha murmured, or maybe just reckless. Revan forced a small, mocking smile. Or maybe I just don't care about your rules. The Alpha's eyes darkened, and the playful glint in his eyes vanished, replaced by something more dangerous. He took another step forward, and Revan's back hit the wall, his exit fully blocked now. Revan wanted to knock himself on his head for not keeping his mouth shut. The Alpha leaned in, so close that Revan could feel his breath, warm against his skin. You should care, the Alpha whispered, his voice dangerously soft, because when I set rules, I expect them to be followed. And when they're broken, he paused. His words hung in the air, a quiet threat, and Revan felt a spark of real fear flare in his chest. He realized that the Alpha could do whatever he wants to him, and he wouldn't have a say in it. After all, he was sold to him. But he was stubborn. He continued to keep his gaze locked on the Alpha's, refusing to show weakness. He wouldn't give the Alpha the satisfaction. The Alpha leaned even closer, so close that Revan had nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. The Alpha had his hands pressed against the wall beside Revan's head, caging him in. Are you really so fearless, Revan? The Alpha murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Or is that just an act? Revan's heart pounded. He wanted to push the Alpha away, but he knew he wouldn't get far. So instead, he clenched his jaw, narrowing his eyes as he met the Alpha's gaze. I'm not afraid of you, he said, his voice steady, though he could feel his palms beginning to sweat. The Alpha's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. Liar, he whispered, his tone soft, almost gentle, though his gaze was anything but. Believe what you want. The Alpha chuckled. I don't need to believe, he murmured. I can see it. Revan's breath hitched, and the Alpha felt satisfied that he could see the cracks in Revan's facade, the fear he tried to hide. His gaze softened, and he stepped back, releasing Revan from the wall, understanding flickering in his eyes. You're stubborn, I'll give you that, but stubbornness can be dangerous in a place like this. Revan forced a bitter smile, refusing to let his guard down, even as the Alpha's gaze softened. Maybe I like a little danger. The Alpha's mouth twitched, as if holding back a smile. Careful what you wish for, Revan, you might just get it. The Alpha turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Revan exhaled a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the wall, steadying himself. Revan thought he could handle the Alpha's presence, but the Alpha was a force that surrounded him, pressing against the walls he'd carefully built around himself, and also pressing him against walls, of course. The next week, Revan had been restless and bored. It has been some days after their encounter, and he couldn't help but want to cross paths with the Alpha again. Just because he was bored, of course, nothing else. He'd begun to make friends with one of the palace guard, and they began sparring, as a way to pass time. But as he stood there, sword in hand, he felt like he was being watched, which was a regular occurrence in this palace. Turning, he saw the Alpha standing at the corner of the yard, arms crossed as he observed Revan's every move. Enjoying yourself? The Alpha asked. Revan forced a smirk, shrugging. It's a better way to spend my time than sitting in that cage you call a room. The Alpha raised an eyebrow. Careful, Revan. You may find your privileges reduced if you're not careful with your words. Revan rolled his eyes, turning back to the guard he was sparring with, who looked a bit shocked by the way Revan was talking to the Alpha. Then maybe you should find a hobby other than watching me. The Alpha's gaze sharpened, and he stepped into the yard, the guards parting to make way for him. He stopped in front of Revan. Then I'll make it my hobby to teach you a lesson. Revan's heart raced, cussing himself for talking back, but he kept his face impassive, refusing to let the Alpha see his unease. Go ahead, I'm not afraid of you. Before Revan could complete his sentence, the Alpha lunged forward, his hand closing around Revan's wrist in an iron grip. He pulled Revan close, his other arm snaking around Revan's waist, holding him firmly in place. Revan's heart pounded as he felt the Alpha's strength, the raw power that radiated from him. Let go, Revan demanded. His heart raced. The Alpha chuckled softly. Why should I? You seem so eager to test me. Revan gritted his teeth, struggling against the Alpha's grip, but it was like trying to move a mountain. The Alpha held him effortlessly and Revan cussed himself again for talking back at the Alpha. After an intense glaring session, the Alpha released him, taking a step back, though his gaze never left Revan's. You're reckless. Revan, he said quietly, his tone laced with something almost possessive. But you'll learn, one way or another. Revan's heart raced, but he forced himself to smirk, lifting his chin defiantly. I wouldn't count on it. The Alpha's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with a dark, quiet amusement. Then I look forward to seeing how far you're willing to go. The Alpha walked out, but not before glaring at the guard. That was kinda hot, the guard said, fanning himself with his fingers, smirking. Shut up, Revan replied, but couldn't help but blush. I've never seen him smile that genuine before. The guard murmured and Revan pretended he hadn't heard what he said. A week later, a servant had come in Revan's room to tell him that the Alpha King was entertaining guests from neighboring packs. Revan had barely enough time to comprehend this before he was being escorted to the grand hall, where the Alpha had apparently requested his presence. As he stepped into the hall, Revan's eyes quickly took in the scene. The room was filled with Alphas from other territories, each of them exuding an air of power and dominance. They lounged around in groups, talking, laughing, but their gazes all turned in unison when he entered. The intensity of their attention felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. At the center of the room, the Alpha King sat with his friends, his dark gaze flicking toward Revan the moment he appeared, he gesturing for Revan to come closer, causing Revan to lift his chin as he walked forward, ignoring the predatory eyes that followed him, trailing on his figure. One of the visiting Alphas with silver hair and piercing blue eyes let out a low whistle as Revan approached. Well, your new Omega is quite the catch, isn't he? He drawled, his gaze lingering on Revan with a look of interest that made Revan's skin crawl. The Alpha King's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression calm, his eyes never leaving Revan. Revan, he said smoothly, meet some of my allies. Revan glanced around the room, nodding politely but keeping his distance. The way these Alphas looked at him made him uneasy. He could feel their eyes lingering on his body. The silver-haired Alpha tilted his head, looking Revan over. So, how did you end up in our friend's little collection here? He asked, a mocking smile on his lips. Revan felt a flash of anger, but he kept his expression neutral. I wasn't exactly given a choice, he replied nonchalantly. The silver-haired Alpha's smile widened, and he took a step closer. An Omega with spirit. I can see why you're keeping him close, he said, glancing at the Alpha King with a smirk. But surely you wouldn't mind sharing him with a few friends. The Alpha King's expression darkened, his presence suddenly filling the room with a possessive intensity that made the other Alphas pause. Revan is here as my guest, he said, his tone cold, and I don't share what's mine. Revan's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the Alpha King. The words sent warmth spreading through him, but he didn't belong to anyone, especially not this king. The silver-haired Alpha raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the possessiveness in the Alpha King's tone. Relax, he said with a chuckle, holding up his hands in mock surrender. I'm only teasing, but you can't blame us for being curious. Another Alpha, A dark-haired man with a scar cutting across his cheek leaned in, his gaze lingering on Revan with a dark look. "Perhaps you're being a bit too protective," he murmured. "An Omega like him could handle a bit of attention." The Alpha King's gaze snapped to him, his expression hardening more. Without a word, he stood, his presence commanding immediate silence. He moved to stand beside Revan, his hand resting possessively on Revan's waist, pulling him close. "Revan is off limits," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Anyone who so much as looks at him the wrong way will answer to me." The other Alphas exchanged glances, but none of them dared to challenge the king. Even the silver-haired Alpha, who had been so bold moments before, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the Alpha King's gaze. After a long, tense moment, the silver-haired Alpha forced a smile. "Well, it seems we'll have to enjoy his company from a distance." "Then," he said, his tone light, though there was an edge of frustration beneath it. The Alpha grip on Revan's waist loosened, turning back to his guests with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good to know we're all on the same page," he said smoothly, but his voice was laced with a quiet warning. The conversations continued, though the mood had shifted, tension hanging in the air. Revan stayed close to the Alpha King's side, still feeling the other Alphas, eyes on him but refusing to show any hint of discomfort. He wasn't about to let them see him as some fragile Omega who needed protection. But as the evening wore on, the other Alphas' glances grew bolder, their smiles creepier. And each time one of the guests let his gaze linger on Revan a bit too long, the Alpha King's expression would harden, glaring at the guest. At one point, the silver-haired Alpha approached again, his gaze fixed on Revan with a look of interest, his voice low as he addressed the Alpha King, though his eyes never left Revan. "I must say, you've chosen well. If you ever tire of him, you know where to find me." The Alpha King's smile was cold. He took a step closer, positioning himself firmly between Revan and the silver-haired Alpha. "I don't think that will be necessary. Revan isn't going anywhere." Revan wasn't sure whether to be angry at the possessive display or relieved that the Alpha King was so quick to protect him. As the night wore on, the Alpha King's possessiveness only grew. His hand found its way to Revan's shoulder and stayed there. Every time one of the guests made a comment about Revan, the Alpha King's grip would tighten, as he fought to keep his temper in check. By the time the guests finally left, Revan was left feeling exhausted. He had barely taken a step toward his chambers when he felt the Alpha King's hand on his arm, pulling him back. "Don't think I didn't see the way you were looking at them," the Alpha King murmured, his voice low. As he looked down at Revan, "You seemed a bit too friendly." Revan scoffed, pulling his arm free. "I wasn't the one inviting them in. If you didn't want them to look at me, maybe you should have kept them out of here." For a long moment, they stood there, glaring at each other intensely, no one willing to back down. Finally, the Alpha let out a frustrated growl, stepping back with a shake of his head. "Fine," he muttered, "but know this, Revan. While you're here, you're mine, and I don't share." With that, he turned and walked down the hallway, leaving Revan standing there, his heart pounding. The next week, even though the king had said he wasn't going to invite the other Alphas to his palace, he was invited to another Alphas event and Revan was again forced to attend. He found himself surrounded by nobles and high-ranking officials from other territories. Some of them were polite and respectful, but it was clear that some of the unmated men had their eyes on Revan. But they didn't dare get close to him, as they had seen that he came with the king. As the night wore on, he began to feel a sudden warmth in his chest, coming in waves that left him breathless. He shifted uncomfortably on his seat, trying to ignore the rising flush that crept up his neck. But it only grew stronger, his body betraying him as he realized, with dread, what was happening. He was going into heat. A shiver ran through him as he fought to keep his composure. It was impossible. His heat wasn't due for another week. But the unmistakable ache and warmth building inside him told a different story. Desperate to escape, he stood and turned toward the doors. But the scent of his pheromones had already begun to fill the air. Heads turned, and he felt the eyes of the nearby Alphas, their gazes intense. Some of the Alphas already standing up. He didn't know why, but his eyes searched for the Alpha King. But he was nowhere to be seen. Panicked, he quickened his pace, hoping to slip out before anyone could react. But before he could reach the door, a hand caught his wrist, pulling him back. It was the silver-haired Alpha, who he found out that his name was Leo. Leo pulled him close, whispering in his ear, "I can help you with your heat." Beautiful, his other hand trailing down Revan's frame. Before Revan could react, the Alpha was pushed backwards by a familiar frame. The Alpha King glared at Leo, who was still stumbling backwards, before turning to face Revan. Where are you going, Revan? The Alpha King's voice was strained, trying to restrain himself. Like every other Alpha in the gathering, he must have caught Revan's scent the moment it hit the air. Revan swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady as he looked up at the Alpha. Let me go, he whispered, his cheeks flushed, his heat making it harder to meet the Alpha's gaze without feeling desire pooling within him. I need to get out of here. The Alpha's grip on his wrist tightened. Do you think I'm going to let you leave alone in this condition? What if there are Alphas out there, he said, possessively. Revan opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips as the Alpha pulled him closer, his scent filling Revan's senses, overwhelming him in a way that made it impossible to think clearly. He could feel his body responding against his will, the heat pooling low in his belly, his pulse racing as he tried to pull away. Don't do this here, Revan whispered, his voice barely audible, though he couldn't keep the desperation out of his tone. His mind was screaming at him to fight, to resist, but his body betrayed him. The Alpha's gaze softened, though his hold remained firm. Revan, he said quietly, his tone gentle, if you need help, all you have to do is ask. Revan glared at him, though it was ineffective due to the flush in his cheeks, and the way his breath came in shallow. And even gasps. I don't need your help, he spat, but his voice was shaky, and he hated himself for it. Just let me leave. But the Alpha King shook his head. Not a chance. You're staying with me, he murmured. His comforting voice somehow made the tension in Revan's body soften. Just a little. The other Alphas in the room were watching, visibly affected by Revan's scent, but the Alpha King's presence was a silent warning that kept them at bay, his possessive hold on Revan making it clear that he would tolerate no interference. With one last look at the crowd, the Alpha King gently but firmly guided Revan out of the grand hall, away from prying eyes and down a secluded hallway. He led Revan to a quiet chamber nearby, closing the door behind them with a quiet click before turning to face him. Are you all right? He asked, his tone gentle, but his eyes were dark and his body tense as he looked Revan over. He used his hands to cover his nose, trying to block Revan's intense pheromones and to control himself. Revan let out a shaky breath, nodding despite the uncomfortable heat that continued to pulse through him. He felt vulnerable, exposed, his usual defiance stripped away by the overwhelming effects of his heat, but he forced himself to meet the Alpha's eyes, his chin lifted in a gesture of stubborn pride. I didn't ask for your help, he murmured, though his voice was shaky. The Alpha's expression softened, a faint, tender smile curving his lips as he took a step closer, his other hand reaching out to cup Revan's cheek. Maybe not, but I'm here anyway, his voice soothing. Revan's breath hitched as he felt the warmth of the Alpha's touch, the roughness of his hand against his skin. He wanted to pull away, to push the Alpha back and escape, but his body refused to obey, his instincts urging him to stay, to lean into the touch that was both comforting and maddening. I don't need, he stammered, his cheeks flushing as he tried to form a coherent sentence, but the Alpha's gaze was soft, patient, as if he could see right through Revan's attempts to resist, to pretend that he wasn't affected. The Alpha leaned in, his voice a quiet murmur that sent a shiver down Revan's spine. Let me help you. We don't have to do anything, Revan. You just don't have to face this alone. But it's your decision. If you want me gone, I'll go. Finally, after a long, tense moment, Revan gave a reluctant nod, his shoulders slumping as he allowed himself to lean into the Alpha's hold, the remaining bit of his resistance slipping away. For the first time, he let himself trust that he wasn't alone. The Alpha lifted his hand from his nose and wrapped his arms around Revan, firm but gentle, as if he knew exactly how close Revan was to breaking. The warmth radiating from the Alpha King's body was comforting in a way Revan hadn't expected. Revan was used to hiding his feelings, to keeping his guard up, but now, in the Alpha's presence, it felt almost safe to let that mask slip just a little. He pressed his forehead against the Alpha's shoulder, breathing in his scent, and it seemed to settle his nerves, reducing the heat a bit, but he still felt intense longing for the Alpha. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The Alpha simply held him, one hand gently rubbing his back. Revan found himself relaxing, the tension slowly easing from his shoulders. It's all right, the Alpha murmured, his voice low and soothing. Just breathe. Revan did as he was told, taking a slow, deep breath. Breathing in the Alpha's comforting scent, Revan pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at the Alpha. I didn't want you to see me like this, he admitted, his voice small. The Alpha's eyes softened. There's no shame in needing help, he murmured. Not with me. After a long silence, the Alpha pulled back and Revan couldn't help but lean into him. I'm gonna run a cold bath, the Alpha said, carefully placing Revan on the bed. No, Revan whined, stay here with me. The Alpha couldn't help but chuckle at his unusual clinginess. I'll be back. promise, he said as he walked into the bathroom. The alpha looked down at his pants and realized that with the way things were going, he himself might need a cold bath. He ran the bath for Revan and helped him in it with his clothes on, not wanting to make Revan more uncomfortable than he already was. Then he went back to the bedroom, pacing up and down, worried. 30 minutes later, Revan decided to get out of the bath. When his heat eventually calmed down a bit, and the bath water had become hot, he walked out of the bathroom with his towel hanging on his hips. He knew it was risky to let the penned-up alpha see him like that, but he had no choice. His clothes were wet and the only clothing item here were the towels. He walked in the room to see the alpha pacing, holding a basket full of snacks and chocolate. Then he froze when he saw him. Revan blushed, his face more red than they already were. "Don't mind me," he then chuckled nervously, quickly running to the walk-in closet. With the alpha's eyes following him, he found only tiny shorts and t-shirts in the wardrobe. Deciding to wear the longest one among the bunch, he quickly put it on, and a large shirt. Revan walked out the closet feeling thankful to the alpha. He knew that if it was other alphas, they would have used his weakness as an opportunity to take advantage of him. "Thank you," he said to the alpha. The alpha's eyes widened. He hadn't expected that from him. He nodded at Revan. "But I don't belong to you," Revan whispered, though the words lacked their usual defiance, his voice softer than he intended. The alpha's lips curved in a faint, understanding smile. "I know," he replied quietly, "but I'll be here for you, regardless. By the way, I brought snacks," he said, gesturing to the basket filled with snacks. "You went out to get it?" Revan asked, eyes widening. "No, of course not. I won't dare leave you here alone in your heat, especially when you're in the bathtub, naked and defenseless. I ordered one of the beta guards to get it." Revan blushed at the words. I think I should go now. "You can call me if you need anything," the alpha said, almost shyly. Revan's heart fluttered at how cute the alpha was being. He didn't want him to leave, and without thinking, he found himself walking towards the alpha in a quick pace, his body betraying his rational brain that was telling him to stop. He stopped just before the alpha, his eyes communicating with the alpha what he wants, but he doesn't dare say it himself. The alpha, understanding him, knows that he was just too stubborn to admit what he wants, and with a quiet sigh, the alpha closed the distance between them, his lips brushing softly against Revan's. The kiss was gentle, unhurried, as if he were giving Revan the chance to pull away, in case he had a change of mind. But Revan didn't pull away. Instead, he found himself leaning into the kiss, his eyes fluttering shut. For the first time since he'd arrived at the alpha's palace, Revan felt something other than anger, defiance, or fear. He felt trust and something else he didn't want to admit. Something that left him feeling both vulnerable and strangely safe. When they finally pulled apart, Revan couldn't hold the alpha's gaze anymore, and the alpha found it kind of cute. "You don't have to be afraid with me. I've been waiting for this day since I first saw you," the alpha said, lowly. Revan's eyes widened in shock. Who would have thought the Alpha King had liked him from the beginning? "You know, it feels strange that I haven't told you my name yet." Revan's brows furrowed in curiosity, realizing that he didn't know the Alpha's name all this time. "My name is Kellen." Revan's eyes widened slightly as he whispered the name to himself. Kellen. He hadn't expected the Alpha's name to sound so soft, so unassuming. It clashed with everything he'd imagined about him. Yet it suited him too. Revan decided to ask the one question he had always wanted to know. "Why didn't you treat me like the others?" He couldn't bring himself to say the word slave. Kellen's eyes softened. "Because you were never just anyone to me, Revan. Even before you were here, I'd seen you before, in one of the pack's celebrations. And I couldn't forget that look in your eyes, that fire. I never wanted to break it. I wanted—" He trailed off, hesitant to reveal too much. All this time, the Alpha hadn't seen him as a possession, hadn't wanted to make him smaller. He had cared. It explained so much. The strange patience, the way Kellen's gaze softened when he looked at him, how he allowed Revan's constant disobedience without punishment. "Kellen, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Kellen replied. "I just needed you to know. You're here because of a terrible bargain someone else made, but you're not bound to me, Revan. Not in the way you fear. If you ever wanted to leave, you could." Revans could hardly believe he was hearing this. An Alpha King offering him freedom, giving him the choice he'd been denied. But as he looked at Kellen, he couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward him. He didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay. Revan lifted a hand to Kellen's face, cupping his cheek. "Don't let me go." Kellen's eyes widened, not expecting Revan to want to stay. The Alpha leaned down to close the remaining distance between them. Kellen's arms wrapped around him, pulling him close as the kiss deepened. After the kiss, Kellen said hello. tender voice, he murmured, "You don't have to stay with me. Revan, if you don't want this, you're free to go. I'll make sure you have everything you need. A place to go, a life outside of this. And if I stay? If you stay," he said, his voice thick with hope, "then you'll be more than just someone bound to me. You'll be my mate, my Luna. By my side. Not because of obligation, but because you chose to be there." Revan felt his heart swell. He had fought so hard to keep his walls up, to protect himself from whatever expectations came with being an Omega in a world ruled by alphas. But Kellen was offering him something different, something that was his choice. Slowly, he reached up, his fingers resting against Kellen's chest. "Then I'll stay," he said softly. "I want this. I want to be by your side." A flicker of relief and joy crossed Kellen's face, and he leaned down, capturing Revan's lips in a kiss that was both gentle and possessive. Kellen's fingers trailed down Revan's arms, before coming to rest on his hips, drawing him closer until there was no space left between them. "Let me show you how much you mean to me." The alpha smirked. Revan nodded, feeling anticipation and trust as he allowed Kellen to guide him toward the bed. He felt cherished, respected, loved, and as Kellen whispered words of admiration in between kisses, Revan let himself believe that this was where he was meant to be. They made love, but it was a fact that it was not because of the heat. The hours passed like a dream. When they finally lay in each other's arms, Kellen's arms wrapped around him, holding him close as though he never intended to let go. A sense of contentment washed over him. As the morning light began to filter through the window, Kellen pressed a gentle kiss to Revan's forehead. "You're mine, Revan," he murmured, his hand brushing gently along Revan's back. "Not because of any bargain or bond, but because you chose to be." Revan's heart swelled, and he looked up, meeting Kellen's eyes. "And you're mine," he replied, his voice steady. "My alpha." Kellen's smile was radiant. He leaned down, pressing a tender kiss to Revan's lips. In that moment, Revan knew that he had found his place, by Kellen's side, as his Luna, his equal, his beloved. It was a future he had never dared to imagine, but now, wrapped in Kellen's arms, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The end.